The Rebel Capitalist Show.
The first thing that people always ask me is, George, if I'm worried about confiscation, and they know history going back to the 1930s, they're Americans, let's say they've got a substantial amount of gold or silver, just something they don't feel comfortable burying in their backyard. What do they do? What's the game plan there?
Well, listen, I always start by answering this question, which is a question that our audience and our clients ask quite often as well, by saying, look, if the American government really wanted to confiscate assets and was in a position where they were so desperate for money that they were going to start, taking from the people, I think that the low-hanging fruit really isn't gold or silver. Gold or silver doesn't necessarily represent as much of the world's wealth or global economy as it once did. It's not as significant an asset class as it was 100 years ago. So if they were really desperate for money, I think they'd be going after things like pension funds, IRA accounts. This is digital. Basically, these are digital assets for the most part. They know exactly how much people have. They know where they can get it, versus kicking down physical doors to take people's gold and silver away, whether that be domestically in the US or offshore. So, in my most honest of answers, George, is I think it's a pretty unlikely scenario. But if you are concerned about it and you're losing sleep over it, that's exactly why companies like ours are in business, or one of the reasons we're in business, is to give people peace of mind. And so you can always store your gold or silver offshore, whether it be in Grand Cayman, whether it be in Zurich or Singapore or places like that, if you want to get it outside of the US.
Yeah, so if you're someone that had a substantial amount and you want to kind of diversify your political risk, maybe you don't want everything in Cayman, maybe you don't want everything in Singapore, or maybe another one of these jurisdictions. What's the best angle? How do you do that? And then what are the pros and cons with each jurisdiction or each main jurisdiction, or are they very homogenous?
No, there's definitely, some variance between jurisdictions. For the longest time, speaking for American investors mostly, they ended up in Zurich. That, like, the Swiss, recipe, or the Swiss solution was kind of where everybody ended up. It was a very limited choice. And then in the mid 2000s, the Swiss started turning over information to the US government. It had more to do with with bank accounts there, but it affected the precious metal storage industry as well. So then Singapore popped up. So now you've got a variety. You can go anywhere from Grand Cayman down to New Zealand and everywhere in between. There's all these jurisdictions. So, the first thing is, at the forefront of that decision, is you want to do a lot of research about the different jurisdictions, because they all have different laws and they all have different views on private property. Some jurisdictions, for example, Grand Cayman or the Cayman Islands and Singapore, were based on British common law, versus you might have some countries in Europe that have a different background for the laws and the way they were written. And there are specific laws about wealth confiscation and the government's title to people's assets in times of crisis. So you probably want to start by doing your research there and really drilling down on 2 or 3 jurisdictions that are most appealing to you. Secondary things that you want to consider are, how far is it from me? Can I get there if I have to? For example, like you just were telling me offline before, you were trying to travel, to get to where you are today, and it was really difficult. Now, that might not normally be the case, but in times of crisis, all of a sudden it is a real thing, and you have to think about that. Can I get to Singapore? Can I get to New Zealand from Miami if I had to, or from New York City? So you definitely want to think about how far a place is from you. You're going to want to think about things like language. I know it sounds a little bit silly, but when you're doing business with people in other countries, other time zones, that adds complexity sometimes to the transaction. It can slow things down. You have to send more emails. You're not awake at the same time to make a phone call. So, there's a variety of different things to consider. But I wouldn't recommend you kind of overextend yourself and say, oh, I'm going to diversify into like 10 jurisdictions. Right. Because chances are, if you do that, you're going to have multiple relationships with multiple vault, operators or vendors on the go. You're going to run into some of the issues that I was talking about. You might run into issues which are very real, like liquidity. For example, if you've got assets in a place like Panama, let's say, a lot of Americans, still use Panama as a place to have a safe deposit box and to store their gold and silver. let's say it's in a private bank in Panama, which, okay, it might be a pretty secure place, but you have no liquidity. You can't sell your gold or silver to that private bank necessarily in Panama. So
Well,
you want to make sure,
right,
yeah,
right.
you want to make sure that one of the things that you're checking on your list is that the jurisdiction you're in has liquidity as well. So there's really a laundry list of things to consider. But I think the jurisdiction is really at the forefront of that question.
So which jurisdictions have the best private property rights? And then which jurisdictions have the best liquidity?
Yeah, that's a good question. The ones I end up recommending most often to our clients are the Cayman Islands, obviously where our business is. It's a country that's really, its lifeblood is wealth management and all the services that are part of the financial system and part of the financial services industry. So the government there understands that if they were to do something silly like confiscate, whether it be people's gold or whether it be from people's bank accounts, they know that they'd be ruining their global reputation as a country where businesses go to look for these types of services. Right. So basically they'd be shooting themselves in the foot. So Cayman is really a country that exists almost solely for that reason and because they have nice beaches. Mm-hmm. So that's one good place. Another good place is Liechtenstein, which is a very small country that's nestled between Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. So it's a tiny little place. It's got about 40,000 residents. I think it's got the second highest net worth per capita in the world. And it's a place that still has a royal family, and the royal family has written laws there that basically state that they have no right to people's personal property in times of crisis. So they cannot bail in times of crisis. So Liechtenstein is another very interesting option, especially if you have business in Europe or you happen to be someone who lives in Europe or has access to go there or needs to go there on a regular basis. And then I think Singapore has to be considered. It's also very similar laws to Grand Cayman. So privacy is very high on the list in terms of non-disclosure of assets of certain categories like gold and silver, for example. That's not being disclosed to the local government. It's not being disclosed to the local tax authorities. And there's a lot of liquidity in Singapore. It's a major hub for trading. So anytime you want to buy and sell precious metals, you can get in and out very easily.
Yeah. Is there substantial liquidity in Cayman and Liechtenstein as well?
Yeah, I mean, Liechtenstein being situated so close to the German market. So the German gold market, a lot of people think when they think of the gold markets, they think of China and India because those two cultures have a very high affinity for gold. But if you think about the history in Germany, because of the two wars in the last 100 years, their affinity for gold is extremely high. And per capita, Germans own the most gold and silver bullion. So very liquid markets in Frankfurt, in Munich. There's some very large dealers there. And then, of course, you have the Swiss on the other side of Liechtenstein. So trading is a non-issue in Liechtenstein. Grand Cayman historically is not a very liquid jurisdiction. But when SWP set up shop, the first thing we did is we went and partnered with U.S. wholesalers. So we brought some of the big players from the U.S. market, from Texas and New York. We invited them into the vault and we said, why don't you guys make a market down here? And we'll take care of all the marketing of our program and getting the clients in here. And you guys can run the market. You can do the wholesale buying, the wholesale selling. So we were able to bring kind of the same liquidity that you'd find in a major market to a very niche offshore jurisdiction.